Imagine you break your arm, you go to the hospital, you get an x-ray, the doctor slaps it up on the light board, and boom, there is the truth right in front of you. A jagged white line across the bone.
Right, black and white, unambiguous.
Completely unambiguous. We love that kind of visible, undeniable proof.
Hmm.
It's comforting to point at a screen and say, there is the problem and there is the reality.
Oh, absolutely.
But what happens when you try to take an x-ray of your identity?
Oh.
What happens when you try to locate the exact shape and structure of your own consciousness? Because suddenly that x-ray machine is totally useless. You are staring into a void, trying to map a landscape that is entirely invisible.
Yeah, and we spend a tremendous amount of energy trying to force human consciousness into that X-ray machine.
We really do.
We want it to be a localized, identifiable object. We want a clear picture.
I mean, we take personality tests, we track our biometric data, we curate our online profiles. We're all operating on this baseline assumption that our quote-unquote true self is this hidden treasure.
Yeah.
And if we can just find the perfect mirror or the ultimate diagnostic tool, we will finally see ourselves clearly in one solid, unchanging piece.
But treating the self as a puzzle to be solved with the right diagnostic tool is a fundamentally modern compulsion.
How so?
Well, it assumes the self is a static entity waiting to be discovered rather than an active process that is constantly occurring. It's like trying to take a photograph of the wind.
Which brings us to our mission for today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at a stack of sources that completely upends that entire assumption that the self is a hidden object waiting for a mirror.
It's a fascinating paradigm shift.
It really is. What we have in front of us is a highly structured, dense, and honestly almost poetic manifesto on the true origins of self-reflection. It proposes a cross-domain hypothesis that tracks how a biological organism first comes to realize it actually exists.
But to set the analytical framework for this, we need to be very disciplined about what we are actually analyzing today.
Right, good point.
What we are about to explore is proposing a purely developmental and structural claim. We are not doing a literary analysis here.
No.
We are not exploring metaphors about the dark side of the human soul or getting into vague spirituality. We are going to look at a mechanical breakdown of cognition, perception, and evolution.
We are going to examine the exact mechanics of self-recognition. But to truly understand the architecture of this idea, you need to hear the foundational text in its entirety. So before we analyze a single concept, before we break down the mechanics, I'm going to read this manifesto all the way through, from start to finish. Just listen to the progression.
I'm listening.
The shadow as the first mirror. A structural hypothesis on the origin of self-reflection. Before the human being ever saw itself in water, before polished metal or glass returned an image, there was already a form of self-recognition taking place. It did not occur through sight as we understand it now. It occurred through relation. The shadow was the first mirror. Not because it showed detail, not because it revealed identity in a precise or stable way, but because it established the most fundamental condition required for self-awareness. Correspondence. The shadow moves when the body moves. It extends, distorts, disappears, and returns. Yet it remains tethered to the organism. This is the first encounter with a principle that will later define consciousness. Something outside of me behaves as if it belongs to me. This is not yet identity. It is not yet ego. It is not yet narcissism. It is the earliest structural recognition of self-relation through difference. Before reflection, there was multiplicity. The shadow does not present a stable image. It presents variation. At different times of day, it stretches into something elongated and unfamiliar. At other moments, it contracts beneath the body and nearly disappears. In low light, it fragments or multiplies. In firelight, it flickers and behaves unpredictably. This matters, because the first mirror humanity encountered was not a fixed, accurate representation. It was a dynamic, unstable, multiform expression of the self. The implication is structural. The first experience of self was not singular. It was already plural. The organism does not begin with a unified identity that is later fractured. It begins with multiple expressions that must eventually be integrated. What later becomes the shadow self in psychological language is not a secondary development. It is the residue of an original condition. The self was never singular to begin with. The mirror is reduction, not creation. When the human being eventually encounters reflection in still water, in polished surfaces, in mirrors, something new happens. For the first time, the self appears bounded, symmetrical, stable, and repeatable. The mirror does not introduce self-awareness. It compresses it. It takes what was once dynamic and multidimensional, expressed through shifting shadows, projections, and relational feedback, and reduces it into a single, consistent image. This is a technological event, not just a perceptual one. The mirror produces a version of the self that can be mistaken for the self itself. Narcissus, the misidentification event. The story of Narcissus is often treated as the beginning of self-recognition. That is structurally incorrect. Narcissus does not invent the self. He mistakes the representation for the totality. He encounters a reflection and fails to recognize it as partial. He does not see the multiplicity that preceded it, the shifting, unstable relational forms of the shadow. Instead, he locks onto a single image and treats it as complete. This is the birth of narcissism. Not self-love, but over-identification with a flattened image of the self. The shadow remains more accurate than the mirror. The shadow, despite being less precise, preserves something the mirror cannot: variability, context dependence, relational distortion, and environmental influence. The shadow changes with light, with position, with time, with surroundings. It refuses to stabilize. In this sense, it is structurally closer to the truth of the organism. The self is not a fixed object. It is a moving relation. The mirror hides this by presenting continuity and symmetry. The shadow exposes it by refusing consistency. Multiplicity is not pathology. What later traditions call the shadow self, or multiple aspects of the self, is often treated as fragmentation, dysfunction, or something to be resolved. This is a misreading. Multiplicity is not a deviation from the self. It is the original condition of the self. The organism is situational, adaptive, relational, and layered. Different contexts produce different expressions, not because the self is broken, but because it is structurally multidimensional. To experience multiple internal positions, multiple perspectives, or multiple modes of being is not evidence of instability. It is evidence of a system capable of holding more than one frame at once. The error of reduction. Modern identity formation often pushes towards singularity. Be your true self. Find who you really are. Integrate everything into one identity. But if the shadow is the first mirror, then the original condition of the self is not singular unity. It is coherent multiplicity. The danger is not having multiple dimensions. The danger is collapsing them into one and mistaking that collapse for truth. A more accurate model. The structure looks like this. Shadow represents multidimensional, relational, unstable expressions of self. Mirror represents stabilized, reduced, singular representation. Narcissism represents identification with the reduced representation as total. From this perspective, the shadow is not the problem. The mirror is not neutral. Narcissism is not vanity. It is structural misidentification. Closing formulation. The first mirror was not made of glass. It was cast by light. It did not show the self clearly. It showed the self in variation. And because of that, it may have been closer to the truth. The mirror came later and offered clarity, but at the cost of dimension. The shadow remains, not as something to be eliminated or integrated away, but as a reminder. The self was never one thing to begin with.
Wow, okay. It is an incredibly dense piece of architecture.
It really is.
And if we are going to dissect it mechanically, like we promised, we have to start at the absolute chronological beginning.
Right. Segment 1.
Exactly. Before we had silver-backed glass hanging in our bathrooms, before polished bronze in ancient civilizations, we have to look at the baseline environment of an evolving organism. The text makes a stark claim here.
The idea that the very first time an organism recognized itself, it did not happen through sight, as we currently define it.
It happened through relation, through correspondence.
I want to really dig into that idea of correspondence because it's the anchor for literally everything else we're going to talk about today.
It's the foundation.
The text says the shadow is the first mirror, not because it shows detail, but because it moves when the body moves. It establishes that something outside of me behaves as if it belongs to me.
Exactly.
But let's look at this practically, because why wouldn't early humans just know they exist intrinsically? Why do they need a shadow to figure that out?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at how the brain actually constructs a sense of the physical body. In cognitive science and neurology, there is a concept called proprioception.
Right, the body's internal GPS.
Essentially, yes. It is your body's ability to sense its own location, movements, and actions. It's the reason you can close your eyes and still successfully touch your index finger to your nose.
Without even thinking about it.
Exactly. Your brain is constantly receiving signals from muscle spindles and joint receptors. It's building a continuous three-dimensional internal map of where you end and the rest of the world begins.
So even in pitch darkness, my brain is running a full simulation of my body.
Continually. But, and this is the crucial part, that simulation is entirely internal.
Okay.
It is a closed loop of biological data. For an organism to develop a higher order sense of self, to move from simply existing to actually being aware that it exists as an entity in a broader environment, it needs external validation.
It needs proof from the outside.
Right. It needs an external surface to bounce off of. Historically and evolutionarily, reflective surfaces were incredibly rare.
I mean, you're not finding a perfectly clean mirror out on the savannah.
Exactly. To find a perfectly still, perfectly clear pool of water in a primeval forest is a highly situational event. It is not an everyday occurrence.
You can't depend on a puddle to build your cognitive architecture.
No, you really can't. But exactly the opposite of a puddle is the sun. The sun is a constant, which means the shadow cast by an upright, moving hominid is an inescapable companion.
It's always there.
Long before an early human ever saw the visual details of their face in a pond, they were spending every waking hour watching a dark shape drag across the dirt.
Just stretching over rocks and mimicking their exact movements.
Yes. And this provides the brain's internal proprioceptive map with its very first external data point.
Let me try to translate this into a feeling we can actually relate to today, because trying to imagine not knowing you exist is a bit of a mind bender.
It's tough to conceptualize.
Think about flying a kite. When you're standing in a field flying a kite and the sun is blinding or the kite is so high up it's just a speck, you don't actually need to see the shape of the kite to know what it's doing.
Right, you feel it.
Exactly. Your brain extends its awareness up that string. You feel the tension. If you pull your arm back, you feel the immediate corresponding tug from the sky.
The physical feedback.
Yeah. And if the wind suddenly drops, the string goes slack, and your hand instantly adjusts. The relationship, that correspondence of tension and movement, comes first. Looking up and squinting to visually confirm the diamond shape of the kite is secondary.
That analogy hits the precise mechanism we are talking about. The tension on the string is the relational correspondence. The shadow operates the exact same way for the early hominid brain.
It's a tether.
It is. When an early human lifted an arm, the shadow lifted an arm. There was a direct, predictable tether between the internal motor command and the external visual result.
So the brain didn't need to see the color of the eyes or the shape of the nose.
Not at all. It just needed to recognize the feedback loop. I generate a movement, and the environment echoes it back to me.
So the shadow is fundamentally a proto-mirror. It's like the training wheels for self-recognition.
It trains the cognitive system. And if we broaden this out to psychology, particularly developmental psychology and early psychoanalytic theory, we see this exact same mechanism operating on a mental level, not just a physical one.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, long before we had physical mirrors, the human psyche was already using the external world as a reflective surface through a process called projection.
Okay, break that down. How does projection act as a mirror without glass?
In early human history, and actually in early childhood development too, the mind cannot initially differentiate between its own internal feelings and the external world.
It's all blurred together.
Exactly. So it projects its own unconscious content outward. Think of animism in early human cultures, giving human emotions, intentions, or spirits to weather systems, to predators, to rivers.
Like saying the river is angry because it flooded.
Yes. If a storm destroyed a camp, the storm was angry. The early human mind is taking its own internal capacity for anger and bouncing it off the storm to make sense of it.
That makes total sense.
The external environment serves as a mirror for the internal psychological state. And the shadow is the physical precursor to this. It is the most immediate, localized external surface onto which the organism can project its own movement.
Okay, so if the shadow is doing all this heavy lifting, if it's the first thing telling my brain, hey, you exist and you're interacting with the world, what is it actually saying about who I am?
That's the big question.
Because if I look at my shadow, it is a terrible representation of my physical body.
Usually, yes.
If I'm walking past a campfire at night, my shadow looks 10 feet tall, jittery, and terrifying. At noon, I barely have a shadow at all. I'm just a blob around my own shoes.
This is where the structural claim of the text becomes truly radical. Let's look at the physical reality of the shadow versus the physical reality of a modern mirror. A mirror gives you a 1-to-1 ratio. It is bounded, symmetrical, and static. A shadow, on the other hand, is governed entirely by context.
Because it depends on the light.
Entirely. It is distorted by the angle of the light, the intensity of the light, and the topography of the ground it falls on. It stretches, shrinks, fragments into multiples if there are multiple light sources, and disappears entirely in the dark.
So it's completely unreliable.
Actually, it is entirely reliable in its variation. It reliably adapts to its environment.
Oh, I see.
And if we accept that this highly variable, shape-shifting phenomenon was the primary tool for self-recognition for hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, then the structural implication is massive.
It changes the whole baseline.
Exactly. It means the earliest baseline experience of the self was inherently variable. The organism learns from the very beginning that its output, its representation in the world, changes depending on the environment.
I have to push back on this idea that multiplicity is fine, though.
Go ahead.
The text claims that the self was never singular to begin with, that this variation is the original condition. But if my ancestors were constantly shifting their identities and behaviors like shadows changing in the firelight, they wouldn't have been trusted by their tribe.
You think so?
Yeah. Doesn't human survival require a stable, predictable ego? If I don't know who you are from one minute to the next, I'm not going to share my food with you. Isn't the unified identity an evolutionary necessity, not a structural error?
That's a common assumption, but you are confusing predictability with singularity.
What do you mean?
A tribe requires you to be predictable within a given context, not singular across all contexts. Let's look at advanced cognition. To survive in a complex social structure, an organism actually must be capable of holding multiple behavioral frames.
Right, you can't act the same way in every situation.
Exactly. You cannot treat the alpha of the tribe the exact same way you treat a newborn infant. You cannot act during a chaotic, dangerous hunt the same way you acted during a quiet evening ritual.
So code switching is an evolutionary baseline.
Entirely. Adaptive coding is a sign of high intelligence. The organism that insists on behaving the exact same way, maintaining a quote-unquote singular identity, regardless of whether it's facing a predator or playing with its offspring, is an organism that will not survive.
They'd be wiped out.
Instantly. The shadow perfectly models this biological reality. It changes shape based on the terrain. The human psyche changes shape based on the social and environmental terrain.
That makes a lot of sense when you map it onto our daily lives right now.
Yeah.
We all have that feeling of being fragmented, and we usually feel guilty about it.
Constantly.
Think about the customer service voice. You're having a miserable day, you're arguing with your spouse, the phone rings, and suddenly you answer with this cheerful, bright, completely different persona. Hi, how can I help you?
It's an automatic shift.
Yeah, and when you hang up, you feel a little bit like a sociopath. You feel fake. We're taught to view that variation as hypocrisy. But according to this model, that's not hypocrisy. That's just the shadow adjusting to a new light source.
That is a perfect everyday example. Modern culture pathologizes variation. We use therapeutic language to label multiple aspects of the self as a problem to be solved.
We really do. We talk about integrating our shadows.
Right. We tell people they need to do shadow work to integrate their dark side and become one unified, authentic whole. We treat the feeling of having different personas as evidence of fragmentation or trauma.
We treat it like the X-ray shows a broken bone.
Yes. But structurally, experiencing multiple internal positions or multiple modes of being is not evidence of a broken system.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Precisely. It is evidence of a highly functional, highly evolved system capable of evaluating an environment and deploying the appropriate behavioral frame. Multiplicity is the baseline.
Okay, so if multiplicity is our evolutionary baseline,
Yeah.
and we are built to be these adaptable, multiform creatures, what happens when we finally build the X-ray machine? Right. What happens when we invent the mirror? Because the transition from the shadow to the mirror is the pivot point of this entire manifesto. The text argues that the mirror does not introduce self-awareness, but rather compresses it.
To understand the sheer force of this compression, we need to look at developmental psychology. Specifically, we can look at the mirror test.
Oh, like Gordon Gallup Jr. stuff.
Exactly. And later expanded upon by psychoanalysts like Jacques Lacan in his theory of the mirror stage.
Right, so the mirror test is the classic animal intelligence metric. You put a smudge of rouge on a chimpanzee's forehead, put them in front of a mirror, and if they reach for their own forehead instead of the mirror, they pass. They have self-awareness.
That is the popular understanding, yes. But let's look closer at human infants. A human infant typically passes the mirror test around 18 months of age.
They see the red mark and touch their own face?
Exactly. They look in the glass, see the red mark on their face, and touch their own skin. It is heralded as the dawn of self-recognition. But think about it. What was that infant doing at 6 months or 9 months?
They were still interacting with the world.
Right. They were lying in a crib, kicking their legs, and watching a mobile spin in response to their movement. They were crying and watching a parent react. They were already engaged in relational correspondence.
They were already flying the kite.
Beautifully put. Yes, they were flying the kite.
So the self was already active and moving.
It was active, moving, unbounded, and fragmented. The infant experiences the world as a chaotic swirl of sensory inputs. Hunger, warmth, sound, and motion.
There's no clear border.
None. So when that 18-month-old is held up to a mirror, something violent happens to their perception.
Violent.
In a structural sense, yes. The mirror takes this sprawling, chaotic, multidimensional experience of existence and slaps a hard boundary on it. It provides a visual perimeter.
It boxes them in.
For the first time, the infant sees a complete, symmetrical, contained package, and the brain says, ah, that singular object is me.
It's a massive reduction of data. It reminds me of the difference between walking through a sprawling city and looking at a 2D tourist map of that same city.
I like that analogy.
I mean, if you're in New York City, you're dealing with the smell of roasted nuts from a cart, the rumble of the subway under your feet, the wind between the skyscrapers, the noise of the traffic. It's multisensory and chaotic.
It's an overwhelming amount of information.
But the tourist map is incredibly clear. It is bounded, it is colorful, and it is stable. If you want to get from the museum to the subway, the map is a fantastic piece of technology.
Right, it serves a purpose.
But the map achieves its clarity by erasing almost everything that actually makes the city real. It erases the weather, the noise, the history.
The map flattens reality to make it usable.
Right. But, and here's where I have to challenge the text's inherent suspicion of the mirror. We all agree that maps are necessary.
They are.
I can't navigate New York City using only the vibes and smells. I need the compression. So I have to ask, isn't that compression entirely necessary to function in society?
What do you mean?
Well, the manifesto says the mirror produces a version of the self that can be mistaken for the self itself. But if we all walked around acting like chaotic, unbounded shadows, society would collapse. We need the mirror to give us a functional, stable ego, don't we?
The text is not arguing that the mirror or the ego is useless. It explicitly acknowledges that the mirror offers clarity and stability. Your map analogy is exactly right. We need the map to navigate.
Okay, so where's the problem?
The structural error, the danger, occurs when we forget that we are looking at a map.
Mistaking the map for the territory.
Precisely. The invention of the mirror, and by extension, the cultural invention of a fixed, singular identity, is a technological event. It provides a static data point. Every time you look in the mirror, you get consistent boundaries.
Do you see the same face?
Yes. But over time, because that bounded image is so clear and so comforting, the organism begins to identify more with the representation than with its own internal reality.
It starts to believe the drawing is the actual city.
Exactly. It begins to believe, I am not the complex, shifting, environmentally dependent process. I am that solid object in the glass.
Which brings us directly to the cautionary tale embedded in the text. The ultimate story of someone mistaking the map for the city, Narcissus.
Ah, yes.
The text says, Narcissus does not invent the self. He mistakes the representation for the totality.
We really need to completely dismantle the conventional reading of the Narcissus myth here.
Because in popular culture, Narcissus is the poster child for vanity.
Right.
He is the beautiful boy who looks into a pool of water, falls deeply in love with his own physical beauty, and wastes away staring at himself. We use it as a moral fable. Don't be obsessed with your own looks. Don't take too many selfies.
He's the patron saint of arrogance.
Exactly.
But look at what is actually happening in the mechanics of the myth, viewed through this structural framework. Narcissus represents a technological transition and a profound cognitive failure.
Walk us through it.
He approaches the pool of still water, which is the mirror stage. He encounters the external, bounded image. His failure is not that he loves himself too much. His failure is a processing error.
The processing error.
Yes. He fails to recognize the image as partial. He fails to realize the water is just a medium.
He forgets the shadow.
He forgets the multiplicity that preceded the reflection. He forgets that he is a living, breathing, relational organism that is supposed to interact with the forest around him.
He's supposed to be hunting or walking or talking.
Right. But he looks at the 2D tourist map in the water, and he is so captivated by its clarity, its symmetry, and its stillness that he decides to live inside the map.
Wow.
He locks onto a single, compressed representation and treats it as his complete identity. He becomes paralyzed by the reduction. He literally starves to death because he won't move.
That reframes the entire concept of narcissism. We typically view narcissism, even clinically, as grandiosity, an inflated sense of self-importance.
Yes, the DSM definition.
But under this model, narcissism is actually a form of cognitive rigidity. It is the over-identification with a flattened image. It's someone who has mistaken their quote-unquote brand or their ego ideal for their actual living totality.
And that rigidity is structurally dangerous. When an organism believes that its bounded image is the totality of its existence, it loses its biological mandate to adapt.
It stops reacting to the wind.
It stops relating to the environment completely. A narcissist stops eating, stops moving, stops interacting with others. He becomes a fixed object.
Because to move would be to break the reflection.
Exactly. The mirror lies to us by presenting continuity, and when we believe that lie completely, we trap ourselves. We stop living to maintain the image.
This connects so deeply to the anxiety of modern life. Because if we track this progression from the dynamic shadow to the stabilizing mirror to the misidentification event of Narcissus, we arrive at the central implication of this entire deep dive.
Which is,
How much of our suffering today comes from society demanding that we behave like the mirror when our biology operates like the shadow?
an immense amount.
Let's look at the modern identity industry. We are bombarded with mandates to be authentic, to find our true self, to build a personal brand on LinkedIn or Instagram.
There is an intense cultural pressure to be utterly consistent.
Yes. If a politician changes their mind based on new information, they're a flip-flopper. If a person behaves differently at a corporate retreat than they do at a rock concert, they are labeled fake. We are constantly trying to collapse our multiple dimensions into one solid, marketable identity.
We demand symmetry from an organism that evolved to be asymmetric.
It's exhausting.
It is. If the shadow is more context-dependent, if it is more environmentally influenced and relational than the mirror, then the shadow is structurally closer to the truth of what a biological organism actually is.
We're not statues.
No, we are living systems. We are essentially a series of ongoing interactions with our environment. Therefore, any psychological push to integrate everything into one rigid, unchanging identity introduces massive distortion.
It's like trying to force the entire chaotic reality of New York City to physically conform to the shape of the 2D tourist map. You'd have to pave over the parks, fill in the subway tunnels, and stop the wind from blowing just to make the city match the drawing.
That's a brilliant way to put it.
The text says, the danger is not having multiple dimensions. The danger is collapsing them into one and mistaking that collapse for truth.
And that collapse requires a tremendous amount of energy to maintain. The anxiety you mentioned, that modern feeling of exhaustion, comes from the constant policing of the self.
We're always monitoring our own behavior.
We expend vast amounts of psychological energy trying to hide our natural variations, trying to prune away any behavior that doesn't fit the image we see in the mirror. We view our situational adaptability as a failure of character rather than the evolutionary triumph that it actually is.
We feel guilty that we aren't a statue.
Exactly. But the shadow refuses to stabilize. It changes with the light, with position, with time. It exposes the fact that the self is not a fixed object. It is a moving relation.
So it's actually liberating.
Profoundly so. By returning to the logic of the shadow, we can relieve ourselves of the burden of singularity. We can accept that different contexts will invariably produce different expressions of who we are, and that this is not evidence of being broken. It is evidence of being alive.
Okay, let's pull all these threads together and reinforce the core structural model we've just unpacked. Because if we follow the mechanics, this manifesto has mapped out a very specific three-step journey of human cognition.
Let's review it. Step 1 is the shadow.
Right.
This represents the original condition, a multidimensional, relational, and highly adaptive form of self-awareness. It establishes that correspondence feeling, the tug on the kite string, comes before visual clarity.
And step 2 is the mirror. This represents stabilization and reduction. It is a technological and cognitive event that takes the sprawling variable self and bounds it into a compressed, symmetrical, and repeatable representation. It creates the 2D map.
And finally, step 3 is misidentification, the Narcissus event.
Where it all goes wrong.
Yes. This occurs when the organism confuses that stabilized, reduced representation with its totality. It is the structural error of believing the map is the territory, trapping the organism in a flattened version of reality.
So the direct application for you listening as you navigate your own life is to remember that your variation is not a flaw. Your multiplicity is your baseline, highly evolved operating system.
It's what keeps you functioning.
Exactly. When you feel yourself shifting to meet a new environment, when you hold multiple, even contradictory perspectives at once, you are not losing your true self. You are simply functioning as intended.
Embracing that original condition is how you maintain resilience. It's how you remain capable of relating to a complex, changing world without fracturing under the pressure to remain identical in every lighting condition.
I want to leave you with one final thought today, something to really chew on that takes this structural model and pushes it into the future.
Let's hear it.
We talked about the first mirror being the shifting, natural shadow cast by the sun. We talked about the second mirror being the stabilizing glass or the pool of still water. But what is the third mirror? Today, our primary reflections are not cast by the sun, and they aren't shown in silvered glass. They're fed back to us through digital algorithms.
Social media feeds.
Social media feeds, biometric trackers, quantified personal data. We are constantly looking into a system that reflects our behavior back to us. But this third mirror doesn't reflect light. It reflects engagement.
It creates a data double.
Yes, exactly. A data double that is entirely bounded, highly reduced, and brutally curated. Yet it masquerades as an absolute empirical picture of who we are. If the original mirror compressed the self, the digital mirror weaponizes that compression.
It predicts our behavior and forces us to conform to the prediction.
It builds a map so compelling that we alter our actual lives to fit its algorithm. So the question is, are we currently living through a mass technological Narcissus event?
That's a chilling thought.
Are we entering a new era of structural misidentification, where we mistake our digital reflections, our algorithmic tourist maps, for the sprawling, living totality of our true selves? It's a murky landscape out there. Keep your eyes on the shadows. Thanks for taking the deep dive.